So it's great to welcome you all to the first set of our breakout sessions for the International Rare Disease Showcase, and hopefully you've got plenty more lined up over the next few days that you'll be attending as well. So before I kick off and introduce today's speaker for the session, I just once again want to thank our sponsors for the 2022 showcase. As you may have seen in the main stage session, it wouldn't be possible to do this without them, so thank you for their support. And without further ado, I'd love to introduce our speaker for the session, which is Anna Cole on behalf of Eurodis, and she's going to be talking about Rare 2030 and Foresight in rare disease policy, and a study that was put together by the European Parliament and the European Commission, which gathered the input of hundreds of key opinion leaders and thousands of patients to propose policy recommendations for the next generation of rare disease policies in Europe. So a really exciting topic that Anna's going to be talking about today. So without further ado, over to you, Anna.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Nice to see you. My name is Anna Cole, Public Health Policy Director at Eurodis. I've been with the organization for over 10 years, on and off now. So it's been quite a while that I've been working in the field of rare diseases. And I just wanted to say hi to all of you. If you do want to turn your cameras on, I would very gladly be speaking to an audience of faces, but I'm happy for you to keep them off for any reason too. No worries. So thank you all. I see we are a collection of patient groups from, I guess, the majority around from the UK, but also other countries, as well as a few consultants that are working either on behalf of companies or in the regulatory and maybe health technology assessment space. So I will be glad to report that all of those topics and all of those needs and unmet needs really are covered in my presentation, or certainly in the recommendations that are coming out of Rare 2030. So what I wanted to present to you today was, as I said, was a bit of the process of how we achieved the recommendations coming from this project. I wanted to underscore the fact that it was a call for a project, as Philippa said, by the European Commission and the Parliament, and you'll see in my presentation why, and that then we applied this Foresight exercise in order to launch a campaign really to translate these recommendations into action. I think some of you are new to the space, some of you have been around for a long time, but you know, every few years we get into sort of a transition phase where we need to start reflecting, right, strategically on where we want to go. And Rare 2030 was really an exercise in that. So without further ado, I will start my slides. Feel free to interrupt. We're a small group if there's anything that's unclear, and I'll certainly leave lots of room and time for questions at the end. So Rare 2030, Foresight and rare diseases. Well, what is Foresight? Foresight is an exercise that a bit differently from a strategic plan or an action plan, really jumps very, very far into the future and considers what kind of trends are happening and helps you consider what kind of actions and policies need to happen today in order to get there. And I think for the field of rare diseases, it is extremely applicable and important because our field is starting to move at an extremely rapid pace. So historically, Foresight has been used in industries like travel, space, urban planning, all of those kinds of things where you need to, automotive design, where you need to think decades ahead because the projects that you're working on take so long that you need to consider the scenarios in the far, far future. So there are not many Foresight studies done in health. There was one recently done on non-communicable diseases in general, so obesity, diabetes, respiratory diseases, those kinds of things. And we work with the same partners for this Foresight. And it's really been, I think, a valuable opportunity for people to recognize how rare diseases and how health in general is starting to catch up in terms of its pace in comparison to these other industries. So we like to highlight our motto here, which is that we shouldn't leave the future of people living with rare diseases to luck or to chance, and that we really need to consciously think about which direction we want to go, because otherwise trends might take us into a number of scenarios that are not exactly the most favorable. So I mentioned the fact that it was sponsored by the Commission and the Parliament. And why is that? Well, many of you may know, or if not, it's important for you to understand the context, that in 2008 and 2009, following a few other very important key legislations like the orphan drug legislations in Europe, of course, we were presented with a kind of policy framework that is a Commission communication and a Council recommendation on rare diseases. The Commission took the time to kind of do a horizon scanning on their own and lay out the areas that are still needing addressing in Europe and across all countries in Europe. And that led to a Council recommendation. So the Council of Europe then, which is a collection of all of the member states that kind of self-mandated, okay, we recognize this horizon scanning that was done by the Commission, and we would like to mandate ourselves to have national plans that are going to address some of these unmet needs. So really trying to think in a strategic and a holistic way, what are the problems that exist for rare diseases and how can we attack them? Now, understanding, of course, as you all I'm sure do, that it's extremely hard to do this one person at a time, one region at a time, one country even at a time, and that you always have to work transnationally or trans group, or the more you can work collectively, the better, because individually we have so little data and information and power and awareness and noise that we really need to work together. So we had these legislations of 2008 and 2009, but it was very clear that they were not enough. They did help in the sense that when they first came out, we only had 5 countries that had national plans. And along the years, although not all at once, and although many of them are still outdated, and certainly, and I'm focusing here on Europe, so I recognize that a lot of the countries in the audience here are not represented. Along the years, it worked. Countries adopted plans, and they adopted them at one point in time for 25 countries in the European Union. What this legislation and this policy framework also did is very much in general brought rare diseases kind of on the map in terms of public health importance and priority. And it started to put in place some practical infrastructures that went along the sort of themes that were described in this Commission communication. So in general, in terms of raising awareness and eliminating discrimination and just letting people know, look, there's a problem, that very much was solved in one way, one maybe small or big way, depending on how you look at it, through the Awareness Raising Day of Rare Disease Day. And so all of us now take advantage of all of the attention that's drawn on that day to send our messages. What it also did was serve the basis for a network of centers of expertise across Europe that were then consolidated into a network of reference networks. And so really started to create pathways when people get diagnosed with a rare disease to, as quickly as possible, be able to find an expert in their disease. And finally, and certainly last but not least, because there are many other things that kind of spawned off of this policy framework, is the fact that we had research infrastructures. So all coming together most recently in what's called the European Joint Program for Rare Diseases, which really helps consolidate the upstream and downstream research for rare diseases, including social research as well. And although we recognize that building of those infrastructures has really led to, and maybe it feels like indirectly for some of us, it's led to a lot of progress, we've got some basic unmet needs that are still not acceptable. It's why we're all here today. And it's really the sort of baseline, if you will, for the Rare 2030 project. So we know, these are just a few examples, I'm sure we could go on and on, that diagnosis is entirely too slow. On average, we know it's around 5 years, but I know that it can be decades for certain diseases. We know that a huge portion, half, again, probably underreported, of people living with rare diseases and their carers are extremely significantly impacted in terms of their daily life, in terms of the costs that it imposes, in terms of the psychological effects, and in terms of the fact that they really have a hard time functioning on a day-to-day basis in society as it's designed today. We also know only 6% of our rare diseases currently have a drug on the market. Of course, very little of those are transformative. So there's a lot of work to be done there. So that gives you a little bit of a baseline. We also know that all of this has been exaggerated, and we also know with the COVID pandemic, but we knew that these disparities exist already. It's kind of the basis for our advocacy, right? Which is that it's just simply not according to human rights, that we wouldn't have the same attention, access, awareness, and healthcare and social systems basically that are formed in a way that gives the best chance to everyone possible. So a few highlights here of how these have been the main disparities for people living with rare diseases as compared to those with other diseases is that we have suffered significant increased vulnerability in the times of the pandemic. We know that care has been significantly interrupted as though it wasn't already hard enough to access before all of this started. We know that we often have worse healthcare experiences than people with other diseases who are simply trying to get diagnosed and make their way through their pathway of care. And we know, of course, that in terms of availability of treatments and really the level of care and the plans and strategies for people living with rare diseases can vary significantly across countries, depending on where we live in Europe and certainly across the world. There are other disparities, I would say, in terms of gender. We know that women often bear the burden more significantly than men in terms of their own experiences as people living with rare diseases, in terms of their odyssey of diagnosis, but also as caregivers, as women are often the primary caregivers for people living with rare diseases. So there's an added impact there. Now, those are all of the things that we knew. Fortunately, some policymakers noticed that there are some unmet needs as well. And I'm going very much into detail, but it's important because it's kind of our legal basis, if you will, for everything that happens afterwards, and hopefully you'll understand why. So there is an authority, the Court of Auditors, who quite simply revisits European policy regularly, which makes sense, to see whether it's working. And the Court of Auditors specifically looked at the Cross-Border Healthcare Directive and ultimately reported that there are some significant weaknesses in the way that it's actually being translated in practice. But they even went further to say that, in fact, the entire sort of strategy around rare diseases needs to be reviewed, because, of course, it doesn't happen in silos. People are not just a person looking for a specialist. They also have to go to school. They need access to their treatment. They need to be able to afford it. And so we were very pleased, I think, to see that there was this sort of general response saying that, look, we need, since 2008 and 2009, we really need to revisit this framework. And what was kind of footnoted in that document was the fact, and this, of course, all happened in parallel. It wasn't a surprise to the community entirely either. But in part of their footnote, they said, in order to revisit and reassess what's going well and what isn't, and if we need a new strategy, we would like to fund a Foresight study to try to do a new horizon scanning, to make a long story short. In addition to that, we're going to look at all of the things that we funded for rare disease policy making and programs before. And we're going to evaluate that at a certain point in time. And this is where the interpretation is loose and where the advocacy steps in, which is that they said by the end of 2023, they will decide whether the strategy needs to be updated, adapted, or replaced. Well, if you by then decide that it needs to be replaced, you can imagine it's going to take a few extra years until that happens. So that's where we're putting extreme pressure. Eurydice and certainly the whole consortium that was involved in Rare 2030 is insisting upon the fact that, look, we don't need to then wait until 2023 to start putting this in place. We have these recommendations here. And we need to to happen faster than that. Not a small side note is that the commission, of course, renews itself as well, and it's renewing itself in 2024. We would really like this to happen before then. So I mentioned the fact that we need all policies to be updated. So really we see this as the beginning of a cycle. And as I mentioned, even before 2008 and 2009, there were some key legislations that brought rare diseases onto the map. And what we put in place once the Foresight study was funded was a consortium. So just a few quick highlights, facts and figures. So 2008 and 9 were the original recommendation. The Foresight study was funded starting in 2019. The recommendations came out in 2021, so spring of this year. So that gave us 2 years to go from point A to point Z, and I'll describe all the steps to you. So Eurydice was selected as the coordinator of the project, but we certainly had a huge consortium of partners working in the field, and I'll describe those in a second, to come up with these final recommendations. That included Orphanet, so the information portal for rare diseases and orphan drugs, Newcastle University, and specifically the John Walton Muscular Dystrophy Research Center. They have historically been very involved in rare disease policy on the EU level. The Teleton Foundation in Italy, who, much like the one in France, is very much a bridge between patient advocacy and patient experience and patient advocacy in research, so fostering research in rare diseases. We had ECNOVA, so the experts on Foresight themselves. We had 2 European reference networks, so really just a representation. Of course, it wasn't all the 24 reference networks, but the idea that they could bring that point of view in mind. And then finally, we had colleagues from the Imperial College of London, who were doing some of the forecasting in the Foresight around how many drugs we can anticipate on the market with current trends. Now, in addition to the partners, we also selected an advisory board to kind of keep an eye on our methods and let us know if we're on the right track. And keep in mind in all of these slides, what I'm trying to do is to describe how we did it, but I imagine you could certainly do the same for your alliances or for your own organizations. So we put together a research advisory board that was comprised of 3 types of individuals. One is individuals in Foresight, and really these are people that are mostly, have an idea around rare diseases, but aren't necessarily working on a day-to-day basis, certainly not as advocates or practitioners. So those that have really an idea around the methodology. Then we had those who are kind of aware of cutting edge technologies and were helping us consider all of the trends. We at Eurydice and all of us really tend to, work in a bubble. We have so much to do already that sometimes we don't have time to consider what else is happening in the world when we're trying to put forward solutions and strategies. And the third group of people were those who are more familiar with rare diseases and more familiar with health policy making. So actually former directorate generals, both of health and research, who could then help us figure out, how to translate these recommendations into practice, and always kind of keeping the policymakers' point of view in mind. So that was one major consultative body, in addition to the partners. The other major body, or bodies, I think, were a panel of experts. So that's where the 200 plus members from all sort of sectors, if you will, that you can imagine, research, diagnosis, both those representing pharmaceutical companies, national authorities, patient organizations, of course, really across the board, trying to keep it as balanced as possible. We had a large portion of those, which were, of course, representatives from the reference networks. And the other bodies, if you will, we had were a group of young citizens with the attempt, of course, to keep the youth in mind. At the end of the day, the policies that we're putting in place now are going to be put in practice 10, maybe 20 years from now. So we wanted to make sure that we had a sort of young point of view, and that it wasn't just people my age and above who were deciding what was happening much after we weren't even here. And the final kind of point of consultation was a survey. So that's the thousands of patient advocates and patients themselves who could respond. So if that gives you an idea of who was giving their opinion, on the right bottom corner, you'll see how. And that's really through 4 basic steps. And this is the case for most Foresight studies. You first establish a knowledge base. What is happening? You then try to identify trends of where things are going in each sort of subject. You finally then realize, okay, if we push those trends in one direction or another, you come up with your own scenarios. And then finally you decide, okay, of those scenarios, if there's one that I think is most ideal, how do we get there? What are the actual policies that we need to put in place? So that's a very simple explanation of the 4 steps that all of these bodies took together now through the format of workshops, surveys, conference calls, all sorts of formats. And I should probably add that all of this happened just as the COVID pandemic was unfolding. So it was both extremely chaotic, but also very challenging to then move all of this online, because there was really, you know, a project that was designed to be done face to face. But I say that because it's possible, and now we are in this virtual world probably sometime. So I think it's even more applicable because we were really forced to come up with some innovative ways to do this together virtually. So the panel of experts, as I mentioned, were really across this huge range of different aspects in the field of rare diseases that are relevant to making policies. And what we came up with in this first phase of the horizon scanning were a series of knowledge-based summaries. They're really, we wanted to call them fact sheets, but they ended up being quite long. So they're summaries of a kind of overview, what's happening right now in the field of healthcare access. Who are the major players? What are the projects that are happening? Where are the current recommendations? Are there any legislations in place? Kind of a cheat sheet, if you will, for somebody who needs to know the highlights of what's happening in that topic. And they're, you know, obviously not entirely exhaustive. They're very much EU sort of level focused, but still they define the problem, and they certainly defined at the end maybe some ideas of trends, because we did a literature review to get a sense of where we're going today in this topic. Once those knowledge-based summaries were published, and it was really to make sure that everyone who was on these calls, workshops, all of these ways that we were trying to go through these steps together, we wanted to make sure that everyone was on the same level. So once everyone was on the same level, we could start asking people about what trends they think were happening. We came up with hundreds of trends and managed to boil them down to these 12, which spanned across those that are both political, economic, social, technological, and legal and ethical. And you can see, I won't go through them all here, but essentially describing things that we sort of either sense is happening. Yeah, I think mostly things that we sense are happening. So really things that are kind of already happening in practice. Another piece of this trend identification was thinking about wildcards, so stuff that is not on our radar. And fortunately, but not by coincidence, pandemics or epidemics were one of those wildcards that we thought about. So market crashes, climate, you know, disasters, all of those kind of things that are, well, we thought, and we still define them that way in Foresight, very unlikely to happen, but if they do, really change everything. So those were, I don't have them here on a slide, but those were also identified. And so what I mentioned was then, if you look at these trends, we started looking at the kind of themes or groups. And what we noticed is that the trends that everyone, because this is very much an iterative process where everyone voted and voted again. So there was a really a consensus around what the major trends for rare diseases were. And what we noticed that there was 2 groups. One was very much around technology, right? So all of the, especially since 2008, all of the new scientific potential that we have in order to address all of our challenges. And the other one was very much around values, which is how do we apply all of this science and technology? Because it's great that it's out there, but somebody needs to put it into practice. And so that's how we constructed this axis of 2 themes, which the one on the bottom was around values. And again, noticing that many of them were focused around how well we work together. So around solidarity. and the other one around science and innovation. And so what we decided to construct, and again, this is kind of a superficial construction and certainly a choice, was this grid that showed, look, we have really 4 ways that we can go in this field. We can be very much working collaboratively. And I'll just detail the y-axis, which is that innovation can very much be either led by the market or it can be led by needs. And this is certainly what we struggle with, in a major way, obviously, for rare diseases. So given those 2 axes, we defined 4 scenarios. One, we could imagine that, yes, we work together. So there's a lot of collective accountability and solidarity. But if you look down in scenario number 2, if we stay in this market-led approach, okay, we're going to work together, but only when it really helps everybody who's involved. And I'd say it's fair to say that we describe this scenario as this is what's going to happen if we do nothing scenario. So there's a lot of collaboration in the field, but there's a lot of people who are interested in investing when there's low-hanging fruit, or when they already know something about the disease, or when they think that it can be a good return on investment. It doesn't have to be financial, but this is the kind of scenario that we imagine if you just let things happen as they are. If we consider a world where people really are not working collaboratively, so one that's very much focused on around the individual. Now that could be an individual rare disease community or an individual country or region, but when there's little collaboration, yet we do consider needs, we could imagine a scenario number 3, which is that you can get what you need, but it's really up to you to find it because you're not able to count on the rest of the people in your collective. On the bottom left, we have scenario number 4, which is that if we really find ourselves in a world, in a society that's very individually based and entirely driven by market-led innovation, we might find ourselves in a world where everything is driven by data, and that there are a sort of collection of individual data that can help the individual, but doesn't necessarily help the collective. So I'm not going into great detail here. Of course, all of it's available on the website and in the report with long narratives and videos and all sorts of ways to describe these scenarios in greater detail. But just to say that we presented these not only to those who were involved, but the greater rare disease community at the European Conference for Rare Diseases last June in 2020, 2 Junes ago. And we kind of voted as a massive group that we would ideally want scenario 1 as the goal. Now that might seem obvious. Yes, wonderful. We would all love lots of investment for social justice, but I think it was an important exercise to publicly agree that we all want to go there, especially for this next phase, which is if we do, well, then we really need to put our money and our efforts where our mouth is, and we need to put some policies in place to make that happen. So the last phase of the Foresight is then to go back around and say, okay, in that case, in order for diagnosis to happen, in order for people to have access to care, in order for more investments to happen in research, in order for people's care to be integrated both from the clinical and the social support side, in order for patient groups to be adequately and fairly involved in the process, in order for data to be well collected, what are the policies that we need to put in place? And I'm making it sound a lot easier than it was, but we came up with 8 recommendations on how to do that. Now, the first and I guess maybe most important recommendation was none of this can happen if we don't have a new European policy framework that will then, in the same way that it did in 2008 and 2009, help national plans get put into place. We're all aware of the fact that we can have these great common ideas, but in reality, health happens in a country, in a city, in a region, and in order for that to really be transposed, national plans need to be there. So we put forward these 8 recommendations and presented them in February of 2022, 21 to the European Commission in the form of a final conference, and then ultimately submitted them to the Commission in May of this year. And what we hope is, as it was described in this Court of Auditors report, that this will be part of the major assessment to see if the policy framework needs to be updated, replaced, or renewed. So that is the ultimate objective of our study. But I think that kind of along the way, what we're also recognizing is national plans are being put into place, national alliances are being started, consultancies are being born every day, work is going on, business as usual. And so these recommendations, the knowledge-based summaries, the trends, the outcomes can clearly be very useful to anyone in this room and to anyone who's working in the space to get a big picture, right? And to think for themselves where they would like to go, and not start from scratch. Now, in addition, so once we handed in the recommendations to the commission, the real work started happening, which is how do we put them into practice? And given that political timeline of 2023, what we recognize is we need to sort of get our act together to start campaigning the European Commission to put forward this new framework. So we launched the 30 Million Reasons campaign for European action. And in May and the beginning of June of this year, we put in a sort of multi-layered strategy to make that happen. So this afternoon, I believe at 4 o'clock my time in Paris, 3 o'clock in the UK, and I don't know what time where you are, I'll be giving a presentation around the campaign and how we really hope that in the next really month, all of this can be put into place. But just ultimately to end with the fact that what we hope for by 2030 is that all countries in Europe and all countries abroad, but certainly Eurodis works on the European scope, will have a consistent plan, a long-term plan, a well-funded plan, and an updated plan that kind of takes all of these recommendations into consideration and all of the progress that we've made since 2008 into consideration, and that they're here to stay. So that's the end of my slides. I'm happy to answer questions. I haven't been looking at the chat at all, but thanks for your attention.